The sun was setting over the rolling hills of Montana, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Rose Anderson stood at her kitchen window, absently stirring a pot of stew while watching the shadows lengthen across their ranch. 20 years of marriage to Tom had taught her the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings, the long days, and most importantly, the warning signs when something wasn't right. That evening, everything felt off. The cattle were too quiet, the dogs too alert. Rose's fingers unconsciously traced the familiar grip of her compound bow, which hung on pegs near the back door. Most folks didn't know that before she became a rancher's wife, she'd been a state archery champion 3 years running. The Anderson Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Montana grassland. They'd built it from nothing, working side by side through drought, harsh winters, and market crashes. Now, with Tom away at a livestock auction in Billings, Rose was alone with their teenage son Billy, who was supposed to be back from his friend's house any minute. The first sign of trouble came when their security lights flicked on, illuminating the gravel driveway. Rose's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Billy's beaten-up pickup truck approaching, but a black SUV she didn't recognize. It crawled up the drive like a predator, its headlights off despite the growing darkness. Rose moved away from the window, her movements calm and deliberate despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. The local news had been reporting a string of ranch robberies lately, desperate men taking advantage of isolated properties. She'd hoped their remote location would keep them safe, but deep down, she'd been preparing for this moment. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she retrieved her bow and quiver. The compound bow wasn't just a trophy from her competition days, it was a tool she maintained meticulously, practicing regularly in the barn where she'd set up a target range. The familiar weight of it now steadied her racing pulse. The SUV stopped just short of the house, and Rose could make out 3 shapes inside. They sat there for a long moment, probably thinking they were dealing with nothing more than a lonely ranch wife, an easy target. They couldn't see her in the darkened kitchen, but she could see them perfectly in the harsh glare of the security lights. Her phone was already in her hand, typing out a quick message to Billy, "Stay at Jack's house tonight. Don't come home." She hit send just as the first car door opened with a muffled creak. Rose took a deep, steadying breath, knocking an arrow with practiced ease. She might look like a simple rancher's wife, but she was about to show these men that appearances could be deceiving. The gravel crunched under heavy boots as they approached the house. Rose moved silently through the kitchen, positioning herself where she could see both the front and back doors. Her mind was surprisingly clear, years of competition experience kicking in. In archery, you learn to control your breathing, to find that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats. This might not be a competition, but those same skills would serve her well tonight. One of the men was carrying what looked like a crowbar. Another had his hand suspiciously inside his jacket. They moved with the confidence of people who'd done this before, who weren't expecting any real resistance. Rose's fingers tightened on her bowstring as she watched them spread out, approaching different entrances to the house. The ranch was more than just property to Rose, it was 20 years of memories, of hard work, of building a life with Tom. It was where they'd raised Billy, where they'd weathered every storm life had thrown at them. She wasn't about to let anyone threaten that, not without a fight they'd never forget. As the first man reached for the back door handle, Rose steadied herself. She'd spent countless hours practicing, perfecting her form, building strength and precision. Now, all that practice was about to serve a purpose she'd never imagined when she first picked up a bow. The security light caught the metal of the crowbar as he raised it, and Rose drew back her bowstring, her muscles remembering exactly what to do. The night was about to take a turn these men hadn't planned for, and Rose Anderson was ready. They'd chosen the wrong ranch, the wrong night, and definitely the wrong rancher's wife to mess with. The first arrow whistled through the air with deadly precision, pinning the crowbar-wielding intruder's sleeve to the wooden door frame. He let out a startled yelp, dropping the crowbar with a clang that echoed through the night. Before his companions could react, Rose had already knocked a second arrow, her movements fluid and practiced. "Next one goes somewhere less friendly," she called out, her voice steady and clear in the Montana night. "I've got 12 more arrows, and I haven't missed a target in 15 years." The men froze, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events. Their easy target had suddenly become anything but easy. The man pinned to the door frame struggled uselessly against the arrow, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Lady, you don't want to do this," the tallest of the three called out, his hand still inside his jacket. His voice carried a hint of nervous tension despite his attempt to sound authoritative. "We just want what's in your safe. Nobody needs to get hurt." Rose's laugh was cold and sharp as the winter wind. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you." She moved slightly, keeping to the shadows while maintaining her perfect view of all three men. "My husband's got a saying about Montana ranchers: we're all either stubborn or crazy, and most of us are both." The security lights cast harsh shadows across the yard, creating a dramatic scene that would have been almost theatrical if not for the very real danger. Rose could see the uncertainty in their body language, the way they kept glancing at each other, trying to decide what to do. They hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected to face someone who not only could fight back but knew exactly what she was doing. The third man, shorter than the others and wearing a dark hoodie, started backing away toward their SUV. "This ain't worth it," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's crazy, man. Let's just go." "Nobody's going anywhere just yet," Rose announced, her bow still drawn. Years of competition had given her the strength to hold this position for minutes if necessary. "Toss out whatever's in your jacket, big guy. Real slow and careful like." The tall man hesitated, his face twisted with indecision. Rose could almost see the calculations running through his head, whether he could draw his weapon faster than she could loose her arrow. She decided to help him with that math. Her third arrow struck the ground between his feet, so close he could feel the wind of its passing. "That was your warning shot," she said calmly. "I don't much like giving second chances." Finally, moving with exaggerated slowness, he withdrew his hand from his jacket, revealing a pistol. Following Rose's terse instructions, he placed it on the ground and kicked it away. "Smart choice," Rose said, already knocked and ready with another arrow. "Now, here's what's going to happen. My son's already called the sheriff's office." This was a lie. Billy was safely at his friend's house, but they didn't need to know that. "They'll be here in about 10 minutes. Until then, we're all going to get real comfortable right where we are." The man pinned to the door frame had given up struggling and now hung there dejectedly. "We didn't know," he said, almost apologetically. "Nobody said anything about the place being defended." Rose felt a surge of grim satisfaction. "Defended? You boys haven't seen anything yet. I've got my bow. My husband? He's partial to that shotgun above the fireplace. And our son? He's a champion rodeo rider who can throw a lasso around a calf at full gallop. You're lucky you got me instead of them." The night air was getting colder, and Rose could see their breath-forming clouds in the security lights. The tall man kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, while the one in the hoodie looked like he might bolt at any second. Rose knew these next few minutes would be crucial. She had to keep them off balance, uncertain, and most importantly, right where they were. "You know what the funny thing is," she continued, her voice conversational but underlaid with steel. "If you'd come here in daylight, knocked on the door like decent folks, said you were hungry or needed work, we'd have helped you out. That's what neighbors do out here. But instead, you chose this." Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the ranch's dogs answered with their own chorus of barking. The sound seemed to break something in the man in the hoodie. "I'm done, I'm out," he announced, turning toward the SUV. "Take one more step, and I'll pin you to that vehicle like a butterfly in a collection," Rose warned. Her arms were starting to burn from holding the bow drawn, but her aim never wavered. "We're all staying right here until the sheriff arrives." The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Rose kept talking, her voice steady and calm, telling them about the other ranchers in the area, all armed, all watching out for each other, all connected by radio and phone. She told them about the last would-be thieves who tried to steal cattle 2 counties over, how they'd been caught within hours thanks to the ranchers' network. With each story, she could see their shoulders slump a little more as they realized just how badly they'd miscalculated. In the distance, finally, came the sound they'd all been waiting for, the growl of approaching engines. But it wasn't just the sheriff's deputy. Word had gotten out somehow, and half the county's ranchers were arriving, their trucks kicking up dust visible in the security lights. The first truck to pull up belonged to Old Joe from the neighboring ranch, his headlights cutting through the dust like searchlights. Behind him came the Reynolds brothers in their matching blue pickups, then Pat Wilson's massive dually, and finally, the welcome flash of the sheriff's deputy's light bar. Rose kept her bow steady, even as relief flooded through her tired muscles. Deputy Chen was first out of his vehicle, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. The sight of a woman holding 3 men at bay with a compound bow wasn't something you saw every day, even in Montana, but he handled it with admirable composure. "Evening, Rose," he called out, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "Looks like you've had some uninvited guests." "Got them right where I want them, David," she replied, not lowering her bow just yet. "The tall one's got a pistol on the ground about 5 feet to his left. The one by the door's wearing my arrow like a fashion statement, and the nervous one in the hoodie's been thinking about running for the last 20 minutes. The other ranchers had formed a loose semicircle behind their trucks, some holding rifles, others just watching with grim satisfaction. Out here, an attack on one ranch was an attack on all of them. The community looked out for its own. Deputy Chen moved forward, smoothly taking control of the situation. As he began handcuffing the first man, Rose finally allowed herself to lower her bow, her arms trembling slightly from the prolonged strain. Old Joe was at her side in an instant, his weathered face creased with concern. "You all right, girl?" he asked, his voice gruff with emotion. He'd known Rose since she first moved to the area with Tom, had watched them build their ranch from nothing. "Soon as I heard the call over the radio, I knew I had to get here." Rose managed a tired smile. "I'm fine, Joe. Just glad Billy wasn't home." She watched as the Reynolds brothers helped Deputy Chen secure the other 2 men. They picked the wrong night to try this. The man who'd been pinned to the door frame winced as Pat Wilson carefully removed the arrow. "Lady," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Rose's smile turned a bit fiercer. "State archery champion, 3 years running. Would have been 4, but morning sickness is hell on your aim." She nodded toward the arrow he was still holding. "Keep it. Something to remember me by." Deputy Chen was already radioing for backup, but his face broke into a grin at her words. "Rose, you're going to have to give a statement, but I've got to know, what made you go for the bow instead of calling us right away?" She thought about it for a moment, watching as the 3 would-be robbers were secured in the back of his patrol car. Didn't want to risk them hearing sirens and running. Besides, she added with a shrug, the bow's quieter. Gave me the element of surprise. As the adrenaline began to fade, Rose found herself shaking slightly. Pat Wilson's wife, Annie, appeared with a blanket and a thermos of coffee. "Here, honey," she said, wrapping the blanket around Rose's shoulders. "You've had quite a night." The ranch community gathered around her porch, sharing coffee and swapping stories as they waited for additional deputies to arrive. Word was already spreading up and down the valley about how Rose Anderson had single-handedly stopped 3 armed robbers with nothing but her competition bow. "Tom's going to be mighty upset he missed all this excitement," Joe chuckled, accepting a cup of coffee from Annie. But he'll be proud as punch when he hears about it. Rose's phone buzzed, a text from Billy. "Mom, is everything okay? Can I come home now?" She quickly typed back, assuring him it was safe but warning him about the impromptu gathering on their front porch. Within minutes, she could hear the familiar rumble of his pickup truck coming up the drive. Billy's eyes went wide as he took in the scene: police lights, neighbors' trucks, and his mother still holding her bow. "Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with concern. Rose pulled him into a tight hug. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just had to remind some folks that Montana women aren't to be trifled with." As Billy listened to the others fill him in on what had happened, Rose stepped away for a moment, looking out over their ranch in the moonlight. The land stretched out before her, peaceful now, the cattle settling back down after all the excitement. This was what she'd been protecting, not just their property, but their way of life, their community, their home. Deputy Chen approached her again, notebook in hand. "Ready to give that statement, Rose? The boys back at the station are never going to believe this one." She nodded, but her mind was already thinking ahead. Tomorrow, she'd need to check the fences, feed the cattle, and maybe set up some additional security lights. The life of a rancher's wife didn't stop for excitement or drama. But she'd also need to order some new arrows, and maybe set up a proper archery range for teaching. She had a feeling there might be some interest in archery lessons among the local ranching community after tonight. The story of the rancher's wife who defended her home with a bow would be told and retold at community gatherings for years to come. But for Rose, it was just another example of what she'd always known, that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the best defense is the one your attackers never see coming. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the Anderson ranch. Rose was up before sunrise, as usual, though her muscles protested from the previous night's ordeal. The compound bow hung in its familiar spot by the door, but now she found herself looking at it differently, not just as a piece of her past, but as a symbol of something more. Tom's truck came roaring up the driveway just as she was finishing the morning feeding. He'd driven through the night after getting her message, his face etched with worry despite her assurances over the phone that everything was fine. The moment he stepped out of his truck, Rose was in his arms, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. "I leave you alone for one livestock auction," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion, "and you go and become the talk of 3 counties. His attempt at humor couldn't quite mask his concern, or his pride. As they walked back to the house, Tom's arm firmly around her shoulders, Rose filled him in on the details she hadn't shared over the phone. His face darkened at the mention of the gun, but he smiled when she described pinning the first man to the door. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Though I have to ask, why didn't you just use the shotgun? It was right there above the fireplace." Rose paused at the kitchen door, considering. "The bow felt right," she finally said. "With a gun, there's no taking back what happens next. The bow gave me options. Gave them options too, though they didn't realize it at first." Inside, Billy was already up and making breakfast, the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and bacon. He'd been unusually quiet since coming home last night, and Rose could tell something was bothering him. "Out with it," she said, accepting a cup of coffee from him. "What's on your mind?" Billy fidgeted with the spatula, not meeting her eyes. "I should have been here," he finally said. "If I hadn't gone to Jack's house. Then I would have been worried about keeping you safe on top of everything else," Rose cut in firmly. "You being away was a blessing, not a failure. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not be where the trouble is." Tom nodded in agreement, ruffling their son's hair like he used to when Billy was younger. "Your mother's right. Though I wouldn't mind if you picked up some archery lessons from her. Seems like a useful skill in this family." The morning paper arrived with their story already on the front page: "Ranch Wife Thwarts Robbery with Olympic-Level Archery Skills." Rose snorted at the headline, she'd never been anywhere near Olympic level, but newspapers did love their dramatic flair. Deputy Chen called mid-morning with an update. The three men were part of a larger gang that had been targeting isolated ranches across 3 states. Their arrest was already leading to breaks in several other cases. The tall one singing like a canary, Chen reported. Turns out your archery display scared him straight. Says he's never seen anything like it outside of movies. As Rose hung up the phone, she noticed several messages from local media wanting interviews. There was even one from a national network morning show. She deleted them all. She hadn't done this for attention, and she didn't need the spotlight. Instead, she spent the morning with Tom, checking their security systems and planning improvements. They installed more motion sensors, upgraded their cameras, and discussed adding better lighting around the barn. Never thought I'd say this, Tom mused as they worked, but maybe we should set up that archery range you've been talking about for years. Could be useful for more than just practice now. Around noon, Annie Wilson showed up with her teenage daughter Beth in tow. The girl clutched her own beginner's bow, looking at Rose with something approaching hero worship. Been practicing in our backyard for months, Annie explained, but after last night, she's convinced you're the only one who can teach her properly. Rose looked at the girl's determined face and felt something click into place. Maybe there was a reason for all of this beyond just protecting her home. Maybe this was an opportunity to pass on something valuable to the next generation of ranch women. Every Thursday afternoon, she found herself saying, "We'll set up targets in the back pasture. Bring your own bow and plenty of determination. I'm not an easy teacher." Beth's face lit up with joy, and Annie gave Rose a knowing smile. By sunset, word had spread, and Rose had 6 more potential students lined up for lessons. The ranch wives and daughters of Montana were apparently ready to add archery to their skill sets. As the day wound down, Rose sat on the porch with Tom, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. The events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike now, but the changes they had sparked were very real. "You know," Tom said thoughtfully, "when I married you, I knew you were special. Didn't realize I was getting a guardian angel with a compound bow, but I'll take it." Rose laughed, leaning into his solid presence. Guardian angel? More like a retired champion who got lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it, he countered. You kept your skills sharp all these years. You stayed calm when most would have panicked. You protected our home without taking a life. That's not luck, that's who you are. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges, more opportunities to adapt and grow. But for now, Rose was content knowing that she had not only protected her home but had perhaps helped forge something new, a stronger, more prepared community of ranch families. Word travels fast in ranch country, and by the end of the week, the story of Rose Anderson's archery showdown had taken on an almost mythical quality. Each retelling seemed to add new details, though the truth was dramatic enough on its own. Rose found herself turning down more interview requests, preferring to focus on what really mattered, her family, the ranch, and her newfound role as the community's archery instructor. The first Thursday afternoon class drew quite a crowd to the Anderson Ranch. Besides the expected students, several ranch wives and even a few men showed up, just to watch. Rose had spent the previous days setting up a proper range in the back pasture, complete with targets at various distances and a covered area for instruction. "First thing you need to know," Rose told her assembled students, adjusting Beth Wilson's grip on her bow, "is that this isn't about being a hero. It's about discipline, focus, and respect for the tool in your hands." She'd worried that the recent events might attract people for the wrong reasons, looking for some kind of vigilante training. Instead, she found her students genuinely interested in the sport itself, in the mental discipline it required, in the quiet confidence it could build. Tom watched from the sidelines, bringing out lemonade and cookies for the spectators. He'd never seen this side of his wife before, the instructor, the mentor, sharing a part of herself that had been dormant for so long. The pride in his eyes was unmistakable. Between classes, life on the ranch continued its normal rhythm. The cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and the endless cycle of ranch work waited for no one. But there were changes too, subtle but significant. The local ranchers had formed a more organized security network, sharing information and resources to protect their community. One evening, as Rose was cleaning her bow, Billy approached her with an old photograph he'd found in a family album. It showed her on the winner's podium at her last state championship, pregnant with him though it wasn't visible in the picture, holding up her trophy with a brilliant smile. "Why did you stop competing, Mom?" he asked, studying the image. "You were really good." Rose ran her fingers over the photograph, remembering that day clearly. "Life happened," she said simply. "The ranch needed attention, you were on the way, and priorities shifted. But I never stopped practicing. Never stopped loving it. Sometimes the things we love just take different forms." The investigation into the attempted robbery continued to yield results. Deputy Chen brought news that the gang had been operating across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, targeting isolated ranches during livestock auctions when the owners were likely to be away. "Your stand didn't just protect your ranch," Chen told Rose over coffee one morning. "It broke open a case that's been giving law enforcement headaches for months. The whole pattern of targeting auction days, we hadn't put that together until your guys started talking." Rose took this information with her usual quiet modesty, but she did notice that the local auction house had started posting security guards and installing better lighting. Small changes, rippling outward from that one night of confrontation. The most unexpected change came in the form of a letter from a women's shelter in Billings. They'd heard about Rose's archery classes and wanted to know if she'd consider teaching some basic self-defense courses for their residents. The idea of using her skills to help vulnerable women find their strength struck a chord with Rose. "You should do it," Tom encouraged when she showed him the letter. "You've got something special to share, something that goes beyond just shooting arrows at targets." After careful consideration, Rose agreed to teach monthly workshops at the shelter. She modified her teaching approach, focusing on building confidence and awareness as much as physical skills. The shelter director reported that even women who never picked up a bow seemed to stand taller after Rose's classes. Back at the ranch, her Thursday afternoon sessions had evolved into something of a social event. Women who had lived in neighboring ranches for years but barely knew each other were forming friendships. They shared stories, advice, and support while their children practiced under Rose's watchful eye. One particularly hot afternoon, as Rose was demonstrating proper stance to a new student, she caught sight of a familiar black SUV driving past the ranch. For a moment, her heart rate spiked, but then she recognized Deputy Chen behind the wheel. He'd taken to making regular patrols past the more isolated ranches, another positive change born from that night of confrontation. "You've started something here," Annie Wilson commented, watching her daughter Beth hit the bullseye for the first time. "Something important." Rose nodded, understanding what Annie meant. This wasn't just about archery anymore. It was about community, about women finding their strength, about turning an act of defense into something that built rather than destroyed. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the targets were packed away, Rose stood in the gathering dusk, looking out over her ranch. The security lights she and Tom had installed cast a reassuring glow over the yard, but it was the darkness beyond that drew her attention, the vast Montana night, full of stars and possibility. She thought about the changes of the past weeks, about how a single act of courage could ripple outward in unexpected ways. The ranch wife with the bow had become something more, a symbol perhaps, but more importantly, a catalyst for positive change in her community. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in rich golds and browns, the Anderson Ranch had become something of a gathering place for the community. The Thursday archery classes were still going strong, but they'd evolved into something deeper than just target practice. Rose found herself not just teaching archery, but sharing life lessons learned from years of competition and ranch life. "It's all about balance," she explained to her students one crisp afternoon, watching them practice their form. "Between strength and gentleness, between confidence and humility. The same balance you need in any part of life." The woman she was speaking to, a newcomer to ranch life named April, had moved to the area just after the attempted robbery. She'd heard the story and specifically sought out the Anderson Ranch for guidance on adapting to rural life. "I never thought I'd feel at home out here," April admitted, carefully drawing her bow. "City life was all I knew. But there's something about this place, this community. It feels real in a way I never expected." Rose understood exactly what she meant. The night of the robbery had revealed something about their community that had always been there, just beneath the surface, a strength built on connection rather than isolation, on supporting each other rather than standing alone. The investigation into the robbery gang had concluded with all members either arrested or turned state's evidence. Deputy Chen brought the final report to Rose personally, along with an unexpected offer from the county sheriff's department. "We're starting a community outreach program," he explained, sitting at her kitchen table. "Teaching people how to protect themselves and their properties, but with an emphasis on prevention and nonviolent resolution. The sheriff thinks you'd be the perfect person to help develop it." Rose was surprised by the offer, but she could see the logic. Her experience had shown that the best defense often came from unexpected directions, and that strength didn't always mean force. Meanwhile, the women's shelter workshops had grown beyond anything Rose had anticipated. Women who'd completed the program were coming back to help newcomers, creating a network of support that extended far beyond the shelter's walls. One former participant had even opened a small archery supply shop in Billings, offering equipment and lessons to other women looking to build their confidence. Tom watched all of this with quiet pride, picking up extra ranch work to give Rose time for her new commitments. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, he handed her a small package. "Been meaning to give you this," he said, almost shyly. "Had it made special." Inside was a beautiful silver pendant in the shape of a bow and arrow. On the back was engraved, "To my warrior wife, who proves every day that true strength flows from the heart." Rose felt tears welling up as she fastened it around her neck. "I'm no warrior," she protested softly. "I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly what makes you one," Tom replied, squeezing her hand. "Warriors aren't born in battle, they're revealed by how they live every day." The pendant became a conversation piece at her classes, leading to deeper discussions about what it meant to be strong, to be capable, to be ready for whatever life might bring. Rose found herself sharing not just the story of the robbery attempt, but of all the small battles she'd fought over the years, against drought, against market downturns, against the 1,000 natural challenges of ranch life. Billy, who'd initially struggled with guilt over not being home that night, had found his own way to contribute to the family's new direction. He'd started a youth archery program at his high school, teaching younger kids the basics of the sport with a patience that reminded Rose of herself. "You know what's funny, Mom?" he said one day, helping her set up targets for the afternoon class. "That night could have turned our home into a place of fear. Instead, it's become more of a home than ever, not just for us but for so many others." Rose looked around at the ranch she and Tom had built together. The security improvements they'd made after the robbery were visible: better lighting, stronger locks, more cameras, but they weren't what caught her eye. Instead, she noticed the new bench under the old oak tree where students waited for their turn at the range, the rack of practice bows Tom had built for beginners, the worn path to the targets that spoke of regular use and learning. The ranch had always been more than just land and buildings to Rose, but now it had taken on an additional layer of meaning. It had become a place of transformation, where people came not just to learn archery, but to discover their own hidden strengths. One of her original students, Beth Wilson, had recently won a regional archery competition. The young girl's victory speech had brought tears to Rose's eyes. Mrs. Anderson taught me that archery isn't just about hitting targets, it's about finding the quiet center inside yourself, the place where courage and peace meet. That evening, after her last student had left, Rose walked out to the archery range alone. The targets stood silent in the fading light, and her bow felt familiar and right in her hands. She nocked an arrow, drew back the string, and found that perfect moment of stillness she'd known since her competition days. But now, that stillness held more than just the focus of a competitor. It held the wisdom of years on the ranch, the strength of community, the power of turning challenge into opportunity. As she released the arrow and watched it fly true to its mark, Rose smiled, knowing that sometimes the best targets are the ones you never expected to aim for. 1 year to the day after the attempted robbery, the Anderson Ranch hosted a special gathering. Ranchers from across 3 counties came together not just to commemorate what had happened, but to celebrate what had grown from that night of confrontation. The back pasture, now a permanent archery range, was decorated with strings of lights, and tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes brought by neighbors and friends. Rose stood at the edge of the gathering, her silver bow pendant catching the evening light. She watched as Beth Wilson demonstrated proper form to a group of younger girls, her movements confident and precise. In just 1 year, Beth had gone from nervous beginner to assistant instructor, helping Rose manage the growing number of students eager to learn. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Tom's voice came from behind her as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You've been mighty quiet today." Rose leaned into his embrace, considering her answer. "Just thinking about how life takes unexpected turns. A year ago, I was just a rancher's wife who happened to remember her competition skills at the right moment. Now," she gestured at the gathering before them. The sheriff's community outreach program had become a model for other counties, with Rose's nonviolent resistance training at its heart. The women's shelter in Billings had expanded its empowerment programs, helping women find their strength through various means, archery being just one of them. And their ranch had become a symbol of something larger than itself, a place where strength and compassion worked hand in hand. Deputy Chen, now promoted to sergeant, arrived with his family in tow. His young daughter immediately ran to join Beth's demonstration group, while he made his way over to Rose and Tom. "You know," he said, accepting a glass of lemonade, "crime rates in ranch country have dropped 30% this past year. Can't prove it's all because of what happened here, but the word's gotten around, these isolated ranches aren't such easy targets anymore." Billy, who'd been manning the grill, came over with a plate of fresh burgers. He'd grown this past year, not just in height but in confidence. His high school archery program had taken off, and he'd recently been asked to help start similar programs in neighboring schools. "Mom," he said, grinning, "Old Joe's telling that story again. You know, the one about how you were calm as a summer morning while holding those guys at bay. Pretty sure the story gets more dramatic every time he tells it." Rose laughed, remembering the reality of that night, the trembling in her arms, the fear she'd pushed down, the desperate hope that she was making the right choices. But maybe Old Joe's version had its own kind of truth. Sometimes the stories we tell about our moments of courage matter as much as the moments themselves. April, the city transplant who'd become one of Rose's most dedicated students, approached with her new baby daughter in her arms. She'd named the girl Rose, something that still brought tears to the elder Rose's eyes when she thought about it. "I never told you," April said, adjusting her daughter's blanket, "but the night before we moved here, I was terrified. Thought we were making a huge mistake, leaving the city for ranch country. Then I heard your story, and something just clicked. If one person could make such a difference in a community, maybe I could find my place here too." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, the gathering moved to the newly built pavilion Tom and Billy had constructed near the archery range. String lights twinkled overhead as Old Joe called for everyone's attention, raising his glass for a toast. "To Rose Anderson," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd, "who reminded us all that the strength of our community isn't in our fences or our firearms, but in our willingness to stand up for each other. And to all the women and men who've taken that lesson to heart this past year. Rose felt her cheeks flush at the attention, but she accepted the toast with grace. As conversations resumed around her, she found herself drawn to the target range. In the fading light, she pulled out her bow, the same one she'd used that night a year ago, and nocked an arrow. The familiar motion brought back memories not just of the robbery attempt, but of all the moments that had led to it, countless hours of practice in her competition days, the quiet mornings shooting targets in the barn, the patience of muscle memory that had served her when she needed it most. She drew back the string, feeling the perfect balance she'd taught so many others to find. In that moment of stillness before release, Rose reflected on how a single action, born of necessity and courage, could ripple outward in ever-widening circles of change. The arrow flew true, striking the center of the target with a satisfying thud. Behind her, she heard the appreciative murmurs of the gathered crowd, but it was the quiet pride in Tom's eyes that meant the most. "You know," he said softly, joining her at the firing line, "when I married a state archery champion, I thought I was getting a trophy wife." He winked at their long-standing joke. "Never imagined I was getting a community hero." Rose shook her head, but she was smiling. "Not a hero," she corrected him. "Just someone who remembered that strength comes in many forms, and that the best way to protect something is to help others learn to protect themselves." As the stars began to appear in the Montana sky, the gathering showed no signs of winding down. Children chased fireflies while their parents shared stories and plans for the future. The sense of community was palpable, not just neighbors helping neighbors, but people who had discovered their shared strength through an unexpected catalyst. The night of the attempted robbery had lasted only a few hours, but its impact had created ripples that continued to spread. In finding her own strength, Rose had helped others find theirs. In protecting her home, she had helped build something larger, a community bound together not by fear, but by mutual support and understanding. As she looked out over the gathered faces, Rose felt a deep sense of peace. The bow in her hands was no longer just a weapon or a sports tool, it had become a symbol of transformation, of the power that comes from standing your ground while holding space for change. The story of the rancher's wife who faced down 3 robbers with a bow would continue to be told, growing perhaps in the telling. But the real story, Rose knew, was in what had grown from that moment, the strengthened bonds, the discovered courage, the quiet revolution of people learning to stand together, strong and sure as Montana itself.